I'm loving this. You all are here to listen, but I also love that there's so much conversation already in the room. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Tiff Beatty. I'm Associate Director at the National Public Housing Museum. Just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for just gathering with us here downtown Chicago. I want to let you all know that you have a little note card on your seat. That is for you. If you don't see one, there should be one close to you. If you need a pencil, we can hand those out. If you have any reflections, questions, comments that come to you throughout the evening, we just invite you to kind of write those down. We will have a Q&A at the end, so we'll collect those from you. I just want to get that out the way. But really, I'm just here to welcome you. So thank you so much for being here at this evening that we have with Richard and Leah Rothstein. Y'all give it up for Richard and Leah Rothstein. Father-daughter duo that have come together to, we're here to celebrate the launch of their new book, Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. So you may have seen we're selling this book this evening, courtesy of Seminary Co-op bookstores. And you may or may not know this event is actually the official launch of the book tour. And so it's very important that that's in Chicago. So please stay to get your book signed after the event as well, although we do also have some signed copies that are also available for sale in case you are not able to stay. We'd love to thank the City of Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for providing this beautiful venue tonight, as well as the Cultural Center staff for all of your support. Thank you. Please also join me in thanking our ASL interpreter, Makita Duncan, as well as our videographer, Jose Leon. Tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be captioned and uploaded to the National Public Housing Museum's website and YouTube channels. So for those of you that want to revisit this or share it with your friends, just look out for that in the next couple of weeks. Of course, I want to thank the National Public Housing Museum staff, board members, and all the community members in the room who've volunteered their time to be here and help out tonight. Thank you all. And last but not least, I want to give a special shout out to M. Ryan Gorman. Can you raise your hand, Ryan? And friends. And BTCRE, which is a program sponsor tonight. So it's really important as a not-for-profit that we are able to raise funds to be able to rent and to program in beautiful buildings like this and to bring authors to Chicago and also different kinds of programs that we put on. And so we're very thankful to our sponsors. And I just want to tell you a little bit about BTCRE before I hand it over to our executive director, Lisa Yoon Lee, to do some opening remarks. So BTCRE is a boutique real estate development, investment, and advisory firm that brings hands-on institutional caliber expertise to revitalize properties, communities, and organizations. Led by Brian R. I. Martino and M. Ryan Gorman, BTCRE cares deeply about the communities in which it works, driven by integrity and a sharp focus on increasing attainability of housing through ground-up development as well as renovation of properties, and renovation of exclusionary policies that limit opportunities for so many today. So y'all give it up one more time for BTCRE. And Ryan Gorman, and it's so important to not only have people who can give money, but that are also aligned with our values. And so we are really appreciative for all of the folks in the room and friends who've supported the museum over the years and continue to support this kind of programming. So thank you all again. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Lisa Yoon Lee, Executive Director of the National Public Housing Museum.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to begin by thanking all of the extraordinary National Public Housing Museum staff for everything that they do every day to make everything possible. That includes Tiff and Mark and Katerina, Sam, Colleen, Emily, Liu, Alex, Ruth, and Alexis. So please join me in thanking them. I also want to begin by recognizing that the region we now call Chicago is Native land. This land has been cared for by many indigenous nations, including the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi people. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, and the Fox, have also called this area home. This place now includes one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States, who continue to contribute to the life of the city, the care for the land, and the waterways. This land was also the home to the first non-native naturalized citizen of the Potawatomi people, John Baptiste Pont de Sable, who lived here with his wife, Kirihawa, who was a Potawatomi woman, whom he married in 1770. Kirihawa was displaced from her home by the US government through a series of forced displacements. And when the National Public Housing Museum opens in our permanent site, in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes, we will be located in a building where many families were also displaced during the Plan for Transformation in an effort to address segregation, crumbling buildings, and racialized poverty. But one of the first actions of the plan was the bulldozing of 11 public housing developments that, when demolished, represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. Our mission at the museum is to fight for the right for all people to a place to call home. Remembering these stories of displacement and finding ways to honor their histories doesn't change the past, but an understanding of the places that we love and work and the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us to create a better future for all of us. And finding ways to build solidarity to fight past injustices in order to build a better and more collective future is part of the work we are committed to at the museum. I'm so particularly thrilled and honored for the museum to be hosting this national book launch for Richard Rothstein and Leah Rothstein's new book, Just Action. Around 6 years ago, The Color of Law brilliantly recounted how government at all levels created segregation. And this new work that we will all learn about tonight describes how we can begin to undo it. It is important that this book launches here in Chicago, one of our nation's most segregated cities. It is also important because when I look in the audience, I also see what makes Tri-City so beautiful. The activists, the organizers, the artists, the scholars, and community leaders, the rabble-rousers, and social justice warriors who've committed their life and work to undoing and addressing deeply entrenched forms of injustice. You are the ones making the connections between public housing, public health, public safety in our carceral state, and public education, and fighting for all that we believe to be a part of the common good and important in a commonwealth for our collective futures. The museum deeply believes in the power of place and memory and asking, what have we not yet learned from history in order to create a more collective and better future for us all? Our work today includes an oral history archive and the Beauty Turner Oral History School that is creating the largest collection of public housing resident stories and training the next generation of oral historians, which is a call to our nation to have a more inclusive foundation for the stories we tell, preserve, and share. The National Public Housing Museum's Entrepreneurship Hub is also building a corner store cooperative, a museum store owned and operated with public housing residents and learning from the historic solidarity economy. Our Artist as Instigator residency connects art, culture, and public policy around housing issues. And this summer, the museum is also thrilled to be in residence in Millennium Park, where we will host civic love events and also a major concert with public housing resident alumni, including Reginald Robinson, DJ Spinderella, Roxanne Shante, and many others. So please mark your calendar for August 25th to meet across the street. And importantly, the permanent museum is currently under construction. You can clap for that. And when we open our doors to all of you next year, we will be able to support the ongoing work for housing justice, contribute to public education with important and enthralling exhibits, foregrounding the stories of public housing residents and the efforts of people and movements to address housing precarity, and be a space for cultural activism and organizing. But now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished New York Times bestselling author renowned for his groundbreaking work on race and segregation in America. His earlier book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, is considered widely, including by myself, as one of the most important and influential works on the subject ever. Joining Richard tonight is his daughter and co-author, Leah Rothstein, a highly respected housing policy consultant who has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. Richard and Leah will also be joined by City of Chicago Housing Commissioner Marisa Novara. Marisa was appointed Commissioner of the Department of Housing by Mayor Lori Lightfoot in May 2019. Believing that housing is a human right, Commissioner Novara directs the city's efforts to create equitably distributed affordable housing across Chicago's 77 community areas through policies, development, and legislation. In just 3 years, Commissioner Novara has helped to pass 9 laws that has created more equity in our city. Before joining the city, Marisa was also the Vice President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. During her 8-year tenure at the MPC, Marisa designed and managed the Cost of Segregation Project, a landmark 2017 study that concluded how decades-old patterns of racial and economic segregation cost the Chicago region an estimated $4.4 billion in additional income each year. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Novara to the podium to introduce tonight's event and to launch it all. Thank you, Marisa.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Lisa and Tiff, and to the National Public Housing Museum for hosting this conversation. And presumably most of you are here because you already know about the National Public Housing Museum, and Lisa and Tiff already gave you an overview. It's certainly well worth your time to check out their amazing body of work. And fun fact, when their museum building is completed, it will also house actual housing units. And I was so excited that we at the city were able to support that. It will be a mix of market rate housing, affordable housing, and public housing in a public housing museum. How cool is that? Also, a strong showing tonight of public servants from the city of Chicago. I see lots of my colleagues around. Great to see you. I'm honored to share this space this evening with Richard and Leah Rothstein to discuss their new book, Just Action. This book, of course, is a follow-up to Richard's groundbreaking book, The Color of Law, which, as you've heard, laid out in painful detail all of the ways that government created and enforced legal ways to segregate and strip wealth from Black Americans. This book, Just Action, that we're discussing tonight, tries to answer the essential question that I hope we were all left with after reading The Color of Law, which is, what can we do about this now? What can I do about this? I have tremendous respect for Richard and Leah for tackling this question. It is really the essential question, but it's also really hard to answer, and I know this from some experience myself. Years ago, as you've heard, I worked with some researchers at the Urban Institute to quantify what Chicago's segregation costs us. In case you missed it, we found Chicago's segregation costs us $8 billion in gross domestic product, 30% more homicides, and 120,000 bachelor's degrees. So when it came out in 2017, the inevitable next question was, okay, so what do we do about that? And just as Richard and Leah did here, a year later, we put up a follow-up report to try to answer that question. It was a roadmap for how to create a more racially equitable region. And I have to say that creating those recommendations, which were more than 25 steps, ranged from a racial equity, employing a racial equity lens to everything that we do, to some very specific steps in housing and education and economic development. Creating that framework for action was exponentially harder than simply documenting the problem. And I've tried to figure out, so why is it harder? And I think from my vantage point now, as housing commissioner for the past 4 years, we have taken many steps to try to both repair past harm and redirect our current work to get to more racially equitable outcomes. And my experience enacting a lot of things actually from that roadmap has led me many times to say that it's much easier to be snarky on Twitter than it is to actually get things done. Yeah. So it's within that reality that I experience this book as sort of a pep talk for normal people, which is importantly not to absolve institutions or government of their responsibility to change. It's more like, hey, regular people, here are some ways you can push to get them to change. And in the words of my friend Nikita Brar, who's a co-founder and executive director of Chicago United for Equity, there are 3 types of power that are crucial: the policy-making power of lawmakers and other public officials, the narrative power of research institutions, news media, philanthropy, and the mobilizing power in communities. So here are some things we know as Chicagoans. We know that there is power in mobilized communities. We know this from the likes of fellow Chicagoans Saul Alinsky and Al Raby and Rudy Lozano. We know that Chicago is a city with profound racial and economic segregation, set in motion at the start of the Great Migration in 1916, and maintained in countless ways, both legal and illegal, ever since. That is also known. What's less settled is what we do about that today. And I salute the Rothsteins for trying to lay some tracks for all of us to answer that question for ourselves. So let's dive in. Hello. Hello. So Richard, let me start with you. Your previous book, The Color of Law, taught us that residential segregation was, to a great extent, created by intentional government policy to ensure that black and white people lived separately. And the book has had an enormous impact. And if you're in my field, it's pretty much required reading. It's a big part of why whenever I am critiquing the private sector, I am pretty quick to add something like, well, as someone who works in government, I'm painfully aware that I sit in a glass house. And because of your book, I always also say, government has long been complicit with the private sector in segregating our communities and devaluing black and brown spaces. So the book was a big deal. And I imagine writing it was no small project. Why did you feel that you needed to write another one?
Well, as you say, the first book described how the segregation of every metropolitan area in this country was required by federal, state, and local government. It was a book of history, and it did change the narrative of segregation countrywide. I don't think very many people today still propound the mythical notion of de facto segregation, that just happened because of private discrimination or private individuals or people wanting to live with each other of the same race. That myth is pretty much demolished. We all understand now, not all, but most people, many people understand that this is an unconstitutional system. We have an apartheid system in this country of state-sponsored segregation. And I would say, Marisa, that it's not just government complicit. If government had required the private sector to behave lawfully, it would have had to do so. So government was the controlling force. But as I say, a book of history. And people could read it and put it down and be better educated about this history, but writing a book of history doesn't change anything. And many people who came to talks like this that I gave, and many people who read the book, said to me, well, what do we do about it now? And so I felt trapped. You know, I had opened this door, and I had to now give them an answer to a much more important question, and that is, what do we do about it? So that's why I felt that I had to write this book, but as you can all see, I'm an old man, and I didn't think it was prudent to expect to finish another 10-year book by myself, so I had to recruit a collaborator. I hired a search firm. I did a national search to find the most qualified person I could to collaborate with me on this work, and Leah Rothstein finally stepped up after years of pestering to quit her job and come work with me full-time on this. So I did, and it's been a terrific collaboration. The underlying theme of the book, though, and this is a more serious comment, is that, as you said, there is no political will in this country today to enact national policy that's going to significantly redress segregation. So writing more and more policy reports about good ideas that we should do to desegregate the society would spend a lot of ink and paper, and I guess, what do you call it, bytes or something on your devices, but it wouldn't accomplish much. What's needed is the engagement of regular people, as Marisa said. People getting together with their neighbors, creating biracial, multi-ethnic committees to begin to take action to redress the segregation that I described. Now, let me add this one other thing. Federal policy was primarily responsible. I say federal, state, and local policy did it. Federal policy was mostly responsible for creating the segregation. But that doesn't mean that federal policy is the best place to start to desegregate and to redress the effects of segregation. Once you have two groups of people who are in different circumstances, African Americans and whites in particular, any local policy is going to affect those two different groups in a different way. And there are so many local policies and programs that can be addressed that may be race neutral today, but that reinforce segregation that can only be addressed at a local level. So we need to begin to solve this problem with local groups, people getting together with their neighbors, with people from different communities. There's some wonderful examples we talk about in this group, to begin the process of redressing not only segregation, but its effects in creating the enormous racial inequality that we have today.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's actually my next question, because there's at one point you say, waiting for the president and Congress to act is an excuse to maintain the status quo. And the overwhelming emphasis that you cover in the book is really about acting locally. And I would also add that the book is really not aimed at heroes and heroines, but to everyday people willing to rise to the occasion in their own neighborhood. And you also note that some people may be oriented to lead a push or an action or a protest, and others may simply attend. And I think that's really important, right? So in a public meeting, for every one person who steps to the mic and says something brave, you need 20 people just to applaud, right? To show that there's a base of support for that point of view, and elected officials certainly need that in order to give them some cover to do the right thing. So Leah, I wonder if you could speak to some of the range of actions that you hope to inspire along those lines in the book.
Sure. So we really focus on the local level, as we've been talking about, because I think, you know, this reality we live in of such a segregated society, of living in communities where everybody looks like us and we don't know people from other race parts of town, It feels, like just how things are and we can't do anything about it. But in reality, there's so much that's under local control that can do a lot in individual pieces. So there were a lot of pieces that went into that were, incredibly documented in the Color of Law, all of the pieces of government policy and private action that went into creating segregation. And so it's going to take just as many pieces to challenge it and to undo it. And a lot of those pieces are under local control. So like my dad said, if we wait for the federal government to do something, we're going to be waiting forever. And instead we can look to the things that locally we can address. And I can give an example. So one strategy we discussed, and we discussed dozens of policies and strategies, we'll probably only touch on a couple tonight, but one is a community land trust. So a community land trust is often used in a neighborhood where land prices are rising and tenants or residents of the neighborhood are at risk of being displaced because they're at risk of being priced out of their neighborhood. And so we profiled a group in Durham, North Carolina, that this was happening in their neighborhood, a lower income, predominantly African American neighborhood outside or near Duke University. It was undergoing gentrification because Duke was expanding. And this group had started by organizing their neighbors about issues they cared about. They started by advocating that the city turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park, because there was no safe place for kids to play and they were playing in the streets and one had gotten killed by a car. And so this galvanized the group and they advocated that the city fulfill a promise it had made to turn a vacant lot into a park. And they won, they got the park and the group was excited. These were just neighbors knocking on doors, talking to each other. They got the park and they got excited about what else they could do to help their community. They learned about a land trust and started one. So the land trust started with 2 vacant properties that the city donated. And on those properties, it used volunteer labor to fix up the houses. And then it sold those homes to lower and moderate income households for an affordable price, $100,000 in today's money, which is pretty affordable for a working family. Home prices in the neighborhood were higher than that at the time. And how a land trust works is the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath a house in the sale of that house. And because the rising cost of land is one of the primary drivers of housing unaffordability, and the rising cost of housing, by taking land out of the equation, the land trust could maintain an affordable price for that home. So the homeowners then own the home like any other homeowners would. And when they go to resell the house, they have to adhere to, or they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that they can resell it for. Sort of in exchange for getting it for an affordable price, they agree to sell it for an affordable price. And that maximum resale price allows them to gain some equity, but also make sure that the new home price is affordable to the next family. So in Durham, in this neighborhood, the blocks where the land trust acquired properties, most of the residents are still African American. Houses in the land trust portfolio now sell for $150,000, which is far more affordable than the other homes in the neighborhood that sell for $500,000. And in the surrounding blocks where the land trust wasn't able to acquire properties, most of the residents are white. So this was an effective, anti-displacement strategy and affordable home ownership strategy. And this is an example of neighbors who got together. They didn't know anything about a land trust before this. One just started volunteering and learned how to keep the books of a land trust, became, the president of the land trust, the board president. So it takes all kinds of people. And to your example, for every person, I'll just add to it, for every person who speaks at a planning commission or a city council meeting, we need 20 people applauding for them, 100 people at home donating to the organizations that are advocating for these changes, and then 1,000 more people to show up for public actions that they organize. So there's a role for all types of people. And I think if we wrote this book thinking everybody who read it would be the people at the front of the movement, I think we would have lost a lot of people, because that's not who we all are. So there's a role for everybody, and we need everyone's participation to see the change and the progress that we're envisioning.
So while you brought up the topic of homeownership, and I want to touch on that for just a moment. You say that it's one way to address the racial wealth gap, but not necessarily always the best way. You say, well, no panacea, helping African Americans buy property is one of the many ways to narrow racial inequality. One obvious solution is to subsidize down payments. This could begin to compensate for decades of discrimination that depressed Black homeownership and wealth. And yet you also detail all the ways that the home buying process is fraught with discrimination for Black people, from appraisals to credit scores to mortgage lending to homeowners insurance. So if homeownership is part of the solution to shrinking the racial wealth gap, which I believe it should be, what are some of the ways that we can make this process more equitable? This is a question for either of you.
There are so many that you mentioned. Those are all the pieces I referred to before. One is the credit scoring system. So we think of the credit scoring system as an objective rating of our future likelihood of repaying a debt. You know, it's based on financial history, it's based on numbers, it's got to be true. If you have a high score, it means you're a good candidate for a mortgage. If you have a low score, it means you're not. If you have no score, you have no chance in even being considered. But the truth is that a credit score is based on your financial history, but only based on a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. So if you've had a mortgage in the past, which whites applying for a mortgage are more likely to have been a homeowner before than African Americans. If you have had a mortgage in the past, that factors into your credit score. But if you've been a renter your whole life, even if you've never missed a rent payment, that doesn't factor into giving you a high credit score. Even though it's the same type of payment, rent and mortgage, often, you know, rent is higher than a mortgage. So it should be just as indicative of your quality of a borrower. So this is an example of a policy or program that is not discriminatory in intent, but it is discriminatory in effect. So 30%, about a third of African Americans have no credit score at all. And that's compared to about 17% of whites. And of those with a credit score, 21% of African Americans have a high enough credit score to qualify for a mortgage, compared to over half of whites. And this is because the kind of financial tools and experiences that African Americans are more likely to have aren't factored into a credit score. Like I said, rent payment history. African American neighborhoods are less likely to have traditional bank branches, so they're more likely to rely on non-traditional financial institutions like payday lenders. Even if you pay back a payday lender with their exorbitant interest rates, that doesn't help your credit score. So this is an example that if we can address this and start to factor in things like rental payment history and utility bill payment history into a credit score, that would open up a lot of opportunity for African Americans to attain the mortgages they need to be able to get into homeownership. This is just one piece of the puzzle, but it's very important. And we think of credit scores, you know, it is a national institution. You know, it's kind of this opaque system run by 3 companies. And there's been some discussion on the national level to start factoring rental payment history into credit scores. It's been under discussion for 15 years or more. There is now a pilot program just started this year to try it out. So that's a long time to wait for change. And, but meanwhile, in our local communities, we can work with our local bank branches and credit unions, and they can individually start factoring in rental payment history. And we profile some in our book that have started to do that. So again, an issue that seems national, it seems like not something we can have any control over, but we really can. We can start working with those institutions in our own communities to change their own practices.
Let me add to that, if I may, because Leah described how you could pressure, a community group could pressure local banks and credit unions to do better going forward in considering the kind of credit worthiness that people without conventional credit might have. When this experiment that she described was announced by Fannie Mae, the Federal National Mortgage Insurance System that funds banks to make mortgages, it issued a press release in which it said that if in the last 3 years rental payments had been considered as part of a borrower's creditworthiness, 17% of all borrowers who had been turned down for mortgages would have been eligible for them. Well, I read that and I said, where are the community groups that are identifying who those 17% of people are in their communities and insisting that the banks who denied mortgages to them because of a misapplication of the credit scoring system insist that these people be compensated for their failure to get approval for a mortgage. So you could start small and forward-looking and press a local bank and a credit union to use a different system going forward, but as a local, I call it a local grassroots civil rights movement, gets stronger, it might begin to consider compensation for people who've been harmed in the past by this system.
Great examples. Thank you. I want to talk. Oh, go for it. All right, so let's talk about single-family zoning, shall we? You say single-family zoning may be the most powerful policy that perpetuates racial inequality. Its end will not in itself fix everything, but its persistence guarantees permanent apartheid for America. Here in Chicago, last summer, we passed the Connected Communities Ordinance. This was made more than a dozen, it was a dozen changes to the zoning code in order to encourage more equitable, transit-oriented development. And we tried mightily to address parts of the city near transit with single-family only zoning as part of this effort. The measure that we introduced said, from now on, within a half mile of a transit stop, and we were only tackling that radius to start, within that radius only, in areas that had previously been or were currently single-family only, you would now be able to build up to a 3-flat as of right. This naively had not struck me as revolutionary. And yet what I came to learn was that people saw this as ushering in Armageddon. I mean, I had an elected official say to me, you know, people really want to be able to throw a ball around in front of their house, which was helpful information. I did not know that people who live in 3 flats are a subspecies that do not play catch. But also, you know, things saying, you know, that I would single-handedly be responsible for corporate headquarters moving out of the city. Things, you know, it became a very, very charged and heated issue. And the point is, ultimately, we failed to advance that seemingly really basic measure. We had to take it out of the ordinance. And what I found really just profoundly disappointing about that experience was that these are communities in which many people are faithfully sporting signs that say hate has no home here and Black Lives Matter, and yet this was the message their electeds very clearly got, was that this was under no circumstances an acceptable bill to pass. So my question is, what do we do? What have you seen work when it comes to successfully achieving zoning that includes people with a range of incomes rather than excludes them?
It's a great question. Changing zoning, as you said, is imperative to start to make the other changes that we advocate for in our book. Changing zoning is not easy anywhere. I can give you examples from across the country that a city takes on a rezoning process with the highest of hopes and they get dashed by community opposition. We call people who oppose those types of changes NIMBYs, not in my backyard. They're people who put up those signs in their front lawns or say they support affordable housing until it changes how their neighborhood looks or what's built on their block. So since we wrote Just Action, I came across a group in California near where I live in Silicon Valley. The heart of Silicon Valley. It's where Facebook was founded and Google is located. It's a very expensive community. Median home prices are over $2 million. This is a place where you would expect NIMBYs to be in full force, and they are, and you'll hear in this story. So there's a group there that formed, they read The Color of Law, and they started to think about how that related to their own region. There was a lot in Color of Law about this region in California, and so they they developed a workshop for their specific region about the specific policies and government institutions and private actors that had created the segregation of their community and had led to the affordable housing crisis that they were in. And they did this workshop across the region to Rotary clubs, school districts, online during the pandemic, and they built up a base of supporters of people who agreed with their values of creating an inclusive and diverse community. To join their organization, you had to agree with those values. So they did the slow work of building a base of supporters in a community where you wouldn't necessarily expect to see that kind of support. And then along came a proposal. A local school district had a vacant school site in a park that it wanted to build 90 units of housing that would be affordable to teachers, given, for teacher housing. And teachers in this area, 30% of them left the school district every year because they couldn't afford to live anywhere nearby. So this was a problem. It was an issue that the school district wanted to address, and it would mean building 90 units of affordable housing on a pretty large lot in a single-family only zoned area. There weren't a lot of neighbors to this site because it was surrounded mostly by a park, but there were enough to oppose it and say the things that you mentioned, the arguments that we hear from NIMBYs everywhere and have for decades is this will change the character of our community. It will increase crime or bring down property values. These are all thinly or not so thinly veiled racist, racially discriminatory assumptions about what's going to happen if multifamily housing can be built in their community. And so this group had been formed and recognized these arguments for what they were, and had built a base of supporters that believed in inclusion, and so they launched a campaign to fight. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the point where the opponents put a measure on the ballot that would make this housing development impossible to build and make any future zoning change a subject that would have to go to the voters. So it would basically effectively make any multifamily housing impossible to build in the whole city. So this group organized a campaign to defeat the measure, and they went door to door, and they started talking to their neighbors. And they, told me stories about going up to big houses and thinking, I'm going to knock on this door, but I don't expect to get much support here. And they would get support from many of the residents they talked to in all types of neighborhoods. And it was because they could talk about how this type of, the single-family only zoning, what it did was inflate property values in this community and make it impossible for current residents of the community, for their kids to ever move home, or for teachers to stay in their community and teach their kids on a consistent year-over-year basis. Or their favorite cafe was closing because it couldn't get service workers who could afford to live nearby and work for minimum wage. So they could see how the exclusion that their community was maintaining was hurting them. And coupled that with the value that they were building amongst their supporters for inclusion and diversity, they defeated the measure and built up an even bigger base of support, and now they're strategizing on what to do next. So I speak to this example to give a story of a place where you wouldn't expect to be successful, and to sort of hearten you that it's not just here that people fight changes to zoning, but it's important work, and I think part of the way we get past the opposition to it and overcome that opposition is both by leading with the values of inclusion and diversity and our obligation to redress the unconstitutional past actions of the government that created these communities to be as exclusive as they are. And also, the third piece is recognizing the impact it has on us personally to maintain segregation and maintain the exclusivity of these neighborhoods.
I want to just remind folks that you have cards that you can be writing questions on, and Tiff, or I think Tiff will come around. Okay. So I want to ask Richard you to reflect on this, and we talked about it a little bit beforehand. At one point in the book, you quote Ibram Kendi, and he's pushing back on the assumption, he says, that racist minds must be changed before racist policy. ignoring the history that says otherwise. Changing minds, he says, is not a movement. Critiquing racism is not activism. An activist produces power and policy change, not mental change. And then you then add, more important than trying to eliminate implicit bias is taking action that redresses segregation, and if the action is successful, implicit bias will wither naturally. So I want to share a story from early, like maybe the first month that I was in this role as housing commissioner, that this made me think about, and then I want you to reflect on why you wrote that. But for me, so interestingly, I live around the corner actually from the future National Public Housing Museum building, which had, as mentioned, previously been the home of Jane Addams Public Housing. And one of the redevelopments of that public housing into mixed income housing was a beautiful new library on the first floor and multiple stories of mixed income housing above. This all was in motion before I was in this role, and there was lots and lots of protests about what it would mean to build this housing and the parking and all the horrible things. And we had the grand opening for this, again, beautiful new library, beautiful housing, just shortly after I started in this role. And one of the people from my neighborhood came up to me at the end of the event, and he basically said to me, I feel like I need to apologize. And in so many words, he said, I did not have the imagination to envision what this could be. And so I acted out of fear. And I can see that it's not scary. And so I just wanted to say that, and he kind of ran away. And I really appreciated that. And I think it's a very telling anecdote to this point, right? That stop asking people for permission and just do stuff, and they will then see, right? So tell me more about your thoughts about that whole part of the book.
Sure. The book is called Just Action, not just purify your heart, but just action. And I think we spend too much time and energy these days in reckoning with racial inequality by trying to purify our hearts rather than doing something about it. Impure hearts arise primarily from observing inequality in our surroundings and assuming that it's natural. We see, well, we've heard references before from Lisa about mass incarceration. We see large numbers of young black men incarcerated. We know intellectually that there's a lot of discriminatory policing that's going on that causes that mass incarceration, but many whites who don't think deeply about it, as they can't, they have no ability to think deeply about it, see all this mass incarceration and they conclude from this observation that they're making and from things they see in the media that young black men have criminal tendencies. It's a natural conclusion from the observations. The best way to change that is to incarcerate fewer black men, and people won't assume when they see a young black man that they have criminal tendencies. The same thing is true of residential segregation. You know, one of the things that it strikes me when I heard you talking about people saying that diverse residents in the community will change the character of the community. Some of these same places that oppose zoning changes that would permit residences of African Americans in particular are places that have no objection to building multifamily housing for senior citizens. So it's not really that the multi-unit building changes the character of the community, it's the fear people have based on racial stereotypes that they've developed over the years. We have a section in the book that I consider very important about one of the problems with housing reform today in this country, and that is we have subsidies at the federal level for low-income families, Section 8, and public housing. We have market rate housing. And too many planners and housing developers assume that since all African Americans are poor, if we can build housing that's affordable for low-income families and mix them with market rate housing for higher income families, we've accomplished something to redress segregation. Well, most African Americans aren't poor. There's a vast African American middle class today that is still suffering from the effects of racial segregation and who don't have access to housing because of the past policies that created this enormous wealth gap in this country. So when we talk about mixed income housing, we need to be talking about housing that doesn't just mix the poor and the rich, but the missing middle, who are disproportionately in a city like Chicago, African American, people who have good jobs but can't afford housing. And when you begin to create those kinds of projects, which mix people of varied income levels, not just the richest and the poorest, you find that people's racial stereotypes tend to disappear because they meet people who are just like them. May I go on for another minute, if I may? We begin the book by talking about something in Chicago that probably many of you are familiar with. How many of you know about the Map Twins? Okay, well, all right, not as many as I thought. Let me describe it to you. There's a very creative Chicagoan here, a photographer. Her name is Tanika Johnson. She took advantage. She took advantage of Chicago's geography, which means you can fold a map of Chicago in half, and 5706 North Hermitage will fall exactly on top of 5706 South Hermitage in Chicago because of the way the city is designed. So she took photographs of these homes that had almost identical addresses, except one was north and one was south, one in the white neighborhood and one in the black neighborhood. She called these houses map twins, and she invited the residents to say, do you want to meet your map twin? And some did, not all, but some did. These were people, whites who had never been to the south side of Chicago, blacks who had never been to the north side of Chicago, except maybe to work in a restaurant. They knew nothing about each other's communities, and they found they had a lot in common. And they began, through that process, to create first, then a map block twins that brought together people on their blocks, and they created the basis of a potential action group to redress segregation in which people understood each other in a way that they never would if they hadn't actually met with each other. We have another example in the book of black and white churches. The cliche is that Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week. We took them in Winston-Salem. There were 6 Presbyterian churches. 3 were all black, 3 all white. Those people knew nothing about each other. The ministers decided to create something called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. They created a 40-member group. 20 had to be white, 20 had to be black from their different churches. They eventually went beyond the Map Twins and actually created real change in Winston-Salem. They got a civilian review board established. They changed the curriculum in the schools to focus more on African American accomplishments, but only because they began to have these interracial relationships that demolished their stereotypes. They didn't first meet among themselves and say, how can we purify our hearts? They got to know each other, and that in itself demolished the stereotypes.
Thank you for bringing up Tanika Johnson, a friend of many of us here, and her great work. Appreciate that. I'm about to turn to some of your questions, but before I do, I mentioned this to you earlier. I want to touch on one premise in the book. You note that you find the term white privilege to be troublesome because it encourages guilt that is neither justifiable nor an effective basis on which to organize. And I want to push back on this point, and maybe it comes down, as I thought more about it, to a distinction between shame and guilt. So I'll just say a little bit more about that, and then I want to get your thoughts. So to me, the concept of white privilege is not to invoke shame, which is a feeling of being fundamentally flawed as a human and unworthy of love. and not much is productive that can come from that feeling, right? But guilt, in contrast, is something that we feel when our actions and our values are not in alignment. There's a psychological discomfort that comes from guilt that I think can actually motivate us in an incredibly productive way. And importantly to this conversation, I don't think guilt has to spring only from something that I did or that I proactively did myself, but the knowledge that I got something, or my ancestors got something, because I am or they were white, and that something should have been received by everybody. That knowledge, I think, should cause me as a white person to experience discomfort. So I think for me, the question is not to not feel that. The point is to learn how do we move through discomfort to something productive and to take action, right? Which is the least that we can do, and it's everything that your book encourages. So let's discuss.
Well, this is terrific because we have something we don't agree about.
Yeah, all right.
Let's talk back about the major problem I talk about in The Color of Law, the major policy that the federal government followed to create segregation in this society. In the post-World War II period, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration created the suburbanization of the country, a program to move all the white working class, lower middle class families out of urban areas. They were mostly biracial at that time because everybody was working for factories that had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals. So everybody was living in downtown areas. The only people living outside those were the very, very rich. So the federal government decided to move all of the white working class families out of those urban areas into single family homes in suburbs that exist in every metropolitan area today. And those suburbs, as I said, were inexpensive. They sold for $8,000, $9,000 a piece in about 1950. In today's money, as Lee referred to, about $100,000 in today's money, affordable to any working class family. Those working class families, returning war veterans, they weren't privileged by getting those homes. They were exercising a right that everybody should have. And telling those people that they were privileged because they got a right that we all should have is not helpful, because it should or shouldn't, when you tell somebody that they're privileged, it's natural to have the feeling that you're somehow responsible for something that was done generations before you were born. The way to, I think, the way to empower people, inspire people to take action, to redress constitutional harms, is not to make them feel personally responsible for it, whether that's your intention or not, because they're not. It's to give them the conviction that as American citizens, they have an obligation to ensure that everybody has rights, not just some people. So I personally think that, I'll say something unpopular. I think that politicians like Ron DeSantis are right. We should not be teaching children to feel guilty about things that their ancestors did. And even if that's not our intent, if we talk about privilege, white privilege, in the way that it's frequently taught, that's the natural conclusion that people draw. What we should do is be giving people hope and inspiration that as American citizens, they can ensure that everybody gets the rights that some people got. And the fact that some people happen to be their ancestors doesn't make them any more responsible than anybody else.
We'll leave that as a agree to disagree. So before we turn to questions, any final thoughts that we didn't talk about that you want to?
Sure. I'll end this part by saying that when I started on this project with my dad, I had a background in community organizing and housing. I worked in the affordable housing field. And I read Color of Law like many of you and like many, many people across the country. And I heard the call to action in it, that once we understand the history of how segregation was created intentionally, we then see that we have an obligation to do something about it. But I wasn't left knowing what to do about it, and I wasn't left feeling particularly hopeful that we could actually affect any change. You know, Trump had just been elected. It didn't feel like we were moving in this direction. And working on this book has turned that around for me, that we cover all of these policies and strategies that communities across the country are implementing in their own neighborhoods, in their own cities and towns. And there's a lot happening around the country locally to redress segregation and to take on these issues. And so it has left me feeling hopeful that there is a lot that can be done, that it is an overwhelming problem that feels intractable, and it feels like, you know, we have nothing, no clear path forward, but there really is, there's many, many paths forward, and the most important thing is just to get started on any one of them in any community across the country, and it's happening. And so I hope this book leaves you all with some hope in that vein.
Thank you, Leah. I'm reminded of Miriam Kaba's quote where she says, "Hope is a discipline." And I think what this book does is give people a series of steps into a place where they can have hope in their communities because they are taking action in this way. So thank you. All right, a question. Sometimes the argument for housing gets reduced to single-family NIMBYs and luxury multifamily housing, YIMBYs, with no conversation about rebuilding public housing. This, of course, is an event organized by the National Public Housing Museum. So how do we bring public housing back into the conversation? Or another way, I guess, to add to that would be, what role do you feel public housing can play in creating the kinds of communities that you talk about?
Well, public housing today, as you know better than we do, has primarily shifted to a voucher system, which is not the creation of buildings where public housing residents live together, but the issue of vouchers, called Section 8 vouchers, that subsidize the rentals of people who can't afford market rate housing. There are many, many reforms. This is all a local issue, and there are so many ways that we describe in the book that a local action group could press to reform the way the Section 8 program is administered. That would do a great deal to redress segregation. One of the reforms that we talk about is an experiment that the federal government started that allows the adjustment of vouchers to be higher in areas of higher opportunity. Right now, the Section 8 voucher program, mostly in most cities, concentrates voucher holders in low-income segregated neighborhoods because that's all the voucher can support. If you provide a higher voucher in more expensive neighborhoods, more voucher recipients will get better housing in neighborhoods with more resources. There are some cities, I know, has Chicago adopted a small area fair market rent standard?
Ann McKenzie's here. Michelle, yes. Yes, and of course you know, because you used to work on Gautreaux, right? We've had a long history of mandating some desegregation with our public housing, but yes.
All right, well, even if it has, I am quite confident that the entire metropolitan area doesn't have that kind of system. And this is something that local civil rights grassroots activists could organize to get to happen because it's all within the purview of local housing authorities. And that would do an enormous service to public housing eligible families to enable them to afford housing in what we refer to as higher opportunity communities.
I was just going to add, to the extent that public housing authorities do build public housing, not just administer vouchers, and it sounds like there's a lot of this happening here, focusing on scattered site public housing projects where it's not a huge high-rise development that concentrates public housing residents in one area, usually a already segregated low-income area. So scattering units around a city in high-opportunity areas, as well as, in all types of neighborhoods. Also building mixed-income projects, like the one that's going to be housing the Public Housing Museum, but ones that include both public housing residents, market rate units, and middle-income housing is what we define as mixed income. So there are ways to address the housing authority's roles, both through vouchers and through development.
Yeah, if I could throw in my 2 cents, unauthorized, because I'm not actually a panelist. I would also say I agree with your point that I think I am increasingly concerned that at the federal level we're so enamored with privatizing what is a public good that we are leaving so many of these things to the market, and the result is very clear. What I would love to see more of from HUD is more project-based vouchers that we can then put into buildings in parts of the city where people don't have a lot of options to live right now if they need a subsidy to live affordably. And I know our friends at the Chicago Housing Authority would love to see that as well. So we'll keep pushing on that front.
But let me say that all of you, local activists and supporters of local activism, have no influence about what HUD does. But how the local program is administered is something you have a great deal of influence over. And in the long run, I hope that you develop the kind of racial justice movement that can have enough power to influence what HUD does. But the place to start is with things that you can influence and win victories at. And I would hope that you would focus your attention on those kinds of possible victories, because that's where you give people confidence to look to build even bigger victories.
All right, well, I think we will end with that call to action. And again, the pep talk to all of us as regular people to figure out how to take our next steps and make change in our own community. So thank you so much, Richard and Leah.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. One more time, give it up for our authors for this book, for our wonderful moderator, Commissioner Marisa Navarra, and for our sign language interpreter, and for all of you. Thank you so much for being here. If you can stay seated for just one more second, I'm going to give some exit instructions. As you can see, there are a lot of people in this room, but we do have 3 doors, and so we have some specific instructions for you all as you are leaving. Door 1, if you already have your book and you are interested in getting your book signed, we ask that you actually line up at door 1 and just snake the line along this south wall right here. So door 1, if you have your book and you'd like to get it signed. Door 2, if you're just ready to leave, you can just go out door 2. That'd be great. Door 3, if you still need to buy your book, you can get it at door 3. So you'll see the sign over here. Sam has you at door 3 to buy your book, door 2 to exit, and door 1 to get your book signed. Thank you again, everyone, so much. We really appreciate you for being here, and come to the next one.
she calls him up. When it ring-a-ling, it only mean one thing. Come on, dial that number. No one answers till it's 2 o'clock.